So I'd like to begin by saying I would like to dedicate tonight's shiur to the memory of my mother, whose yortzeit is this coming Shabbat. And maybe at the end I'll say a few words about my mother. The topic tonight is righteous women and redemption. And so what I would like to do is look, and as you see, right, the source sheet has been posted. People, I think, were sent a link before the class. So I hope that you will follow with me. The opening chapter, well, maybe I should say the following. The first two chapters of Shemot are very, very unusual in that women seem to play a very, very central role. And that's essentially what I'd like to look at tonight. Primarily what we're going to be looking at is the first chapter, the story of the midwives. We'll then proceed to the beginning of the second chapter, looking at Moshe's mother and sister. And if time allows, we'll also say something about Pharaoh's daughter. So without any further ado, chapter 1 of the book of Shemot is essentially describing the process of the subjugation of the Jewish people, of the whole process of their enslavement. And I've mentioned in previous sessions, the Ramban, Nachmanides, who says that the book of Shemot is the book of exile and redemption. And in fact, the opening chapter is really describing the exile. And as I said, the enslavement of the Jewish people. And so what I'd like to do now is to begin by focusing on the story of the midwives, which is in the middle, well, maybe not the middle, but in the context of the process of enslavement of the Jewish people. Now, one of the things which Nachmanides spends a lot of time talking about is the wisdom, cleverness that Pharaoh uses in terms of enslaving the Jewish people. And that's actually articulated in verse 10, when Pharaoh says, let us deal, chapter 1, verse 10, where Pharaoh says, let us deal wisely with the Jewish people. So we should keep that in mind when we now look at the story of the midwives. So let's look at the first reference, which is chapter 1, verse 15. Vayomer melech Mitzrayim lamiyaldot ha'ivriot, and the king of Egypt said to the midwives, the Hebrews, Asher shema achat shifra v'shema shenit pu'ah, that one of them was called Shifra and one of them was called Pu'ah. And then in the next verse, he says the following, Vayomer biyaletchen et ha'ivriot uriten al ha'avnayim im benhu v'hamiten oto v'im bati v'chaya. And he said, when you give birth to the Hebrews and you see, right, and I'll translate this as on the birth stool, if it's a boy, you should kill him. And if it's a girl, you should have her live. So I would like to begin by noting a number of things. I'll just say this right now. It's very interesting how throughout chapter 1, Pharaoh is referred to as the king of Egypt. It's only at the very last verse, which unfortunately I did not bring over here. So let me just hold 1 second. This is chapter 1, verse 22. It's very interesting how it says, Vayitzav Paro lechol amo lemor, that Pharaoh commands all of his people, saying, Kol habein hayilodu, whichever child is born, you should throw into the river, and all the daughters, all the girls, you should keep alive. It's actually what I said is not completely accurate, because already in the part that I gave you, another few sentences down in verse 19, it says, and the midwife said to Pharaoh. And in fact, one of the things which is fascinating is, why is the king referred to sometimes as the king of Egypt? Why do we sometimes call him Pharaoh? And I have to say that today, as I was preparing the shir, I actually left my preparations perplexed, because I'm still not convinced of some theory that's consistent. But for the moment, let's look at our verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the midwives, one of whom is called Shifra, one of whom is called Pu'ah. And here we have, there are a number of problems in this verse. Probably one of the things which is most striking is, it says the king said to them, but it doesn't tell me what he says. And this is especially striking since it says in the beginning of the next verse, which I read, 16, Vayomer, and he said. But wait a second, if it would have just said, and the king said, right in verse 15, and then it would have continued by saying, when you give birth to the Hebrews, so then we would have understood this is what he said. But the fact that he uses the word he said twice without telling me in the first verse, what is it exactly that he said? That's a problem. Well, what I'd like to begin with is something which, on the one hand, would seem to be very straightforward, but is not straightforward at all, which is, who are these two women? And I'd like to begin, if you look below, you see I have Rashi's comment, but I'd like to skip Rashi for the moment. I'd like to go to the Rashbam. The Rashbam says, La miyaldot ha'ivriot. He translates as, La miyaldot shehem ivriot. That Pharaoh said to the midwives, who are Hebrews. And what we see over here is that this phrase is actually not so easy to translate, because the Rashbam is telling you that when it says La miyaldot ha'ivriot, ha'ivriot is in fact defining who these midwives are. Who are these midwives? They are Hebrews. Now, the overwhelming majority of commentaries understand the verse that way. Abarbanel, who follows the Rashbam, doesn't understand it that way. And what he says is, Velo hayu ivriot. These midwives were actually not Hebrews. And then he goes on to articulate, Ki ech yivtach libo, that how could his heart have confidence, b'nashim ha'ivriot, in the Hebrew women, sheyamitu vladehen, that they would put to death their children. And he goes on to say, Aval hayu mitzriyot. These were Egyptians, miyaldot et ha'ivriot, who birthed the Hebrew women. And then he says, Ritzono lomar, that is to say, ozrototan laledet, okay, who would help them in giving birth, Kmosha Amar, as Pharaoh says, biyaletchen et ha'ivriot, when you, right, give birth or help the Hebrew women give birth. Okay, now, so I want to point out that, there are two ways of reading this phrase. You could say miyaldot ha'ivriot, as the Rashbam says, means the midwives who are Hebrews. Or you could read it as the Abarbanel, the midwives of the Hebrews. But in fact, the midwives themselves are not Hebrews, they are Egyptian. And in fact, I'll go back now to Rashi. Rashi quotes a midrash. When it gives the names of the midwives, he says, Shifra, if you go back to Rashi, Zo Yocheved. This is Yocheved, and for all those of you who know, Yocheved is the mother of Moshe. Al Shem Shemeshaperet et Havlad. And why is she called Shifra? Because she beautifies, she fixes up the baby. Pu'ah, Zo Miriam. This is Miriam, Moshe's sister. Shepo'ah umedaberet. Because she coos and she speaks. V'hogal Havlad, and she talks to the little baby, Kederach hanashim, as is the manner of the women, Hamefaisot tinok habocha, that try to somehow pacify a child who cries. And by the way, this is a position which I think many, many commentaries adopt. So let me say this at the outset. The overwhelming majority of commentaries actually understand this in the manner of the Rashbam, that the midwives were actually Hebrews, were Jewish. And in fact, they go by what is the midrashic understanding that Rashi brings, that in fact, one of them is Moshe's mother and the other one is Moshe's, Moshe's sister. There's another midrash that says that it wasn't in fact Moshe's sister, but it was Aaron's wife, Elisheva. Why the midrash says this, I'll come to in a few more moments. But that's one interpretation, that these midwives were Jewish. The Abarbanel says that in fact the midwives are Egyptians. And what's fascinating is, from the text itself, okay, it's ambiguous. It's not at all clear how to read this, but the Abarbanel tries to somehow support the idea that they're Egyptian, because what he says is it doesn't make sense that Pharaoh would be relying on Jewish midwives to kill their own. And if this is a plan, right, which he really would like to see happen, it makes sense that Pharaoh will be collaborating with his own people. Now, I'd just like to pause for a moment and to say that, in fact, there's a lot to be said for the Abarbanel's comment. And in fact, we find at the very beginning, as I said, the opening verse, which really begins the enslavement of the Jewish people, and I apologize that I didn't bring it over here, which essentially is in verse 10. Pharaoh says to his, actually 9, where Pharaoh says to his people, behold, the Jewish people have become very numerous. Let us now deal wisely with them, which means that Pharaoh is concocting a plan with the cooperation, you could say with the backing of his people. And so therefore, there's a lot of sense to, as the plan evolves, that Pharaoh will be involving his own people in the execution of that plan. And even at the very end, we find in the, as I said, the last verse of the chapter, is that Pharaoh commands all of his people, that all of the boys should be thrown into the river and put to death, and all the girls should be kept alive. So this is the Abarbanel's understanding that it's logical that these women should be Egyptians. But then there's a certain issue, which the Abarbanel himself is aware of, where in verse 17, if we go back to the opening reference, it says, Vatirena hamiyaldot et ha'elohim, and the midwives feared God. V'lo asu kasher diber alehem melech Mitzrayim, they didn't do what the king of Egypt commanded them. Vatchayena tal yeladim, and they kept the babies alive. So if you look at the continuation of the Abarbanel, he says, V'hinei hamiyaldot ha'hena, these midwives, im heyotam mitzriyot, with the very fact that they're Egyptians, or one might say, despite the fact that they're Egyptians, yaru et halokim, they feared God, v'lo asu, and they didn't do davar mimashet tziva otam melech Mitzrayim, they didn't do anything which the king of Egypt commanded them to do, ad shehu hochichan alav, until he rebuked them. Okay? So what the Abarbanel is saying, and he's aware of the problem, but wait, it says they fear God. So the Abarbanel says, okay, you can have Egyptians who also fear God. And despite the fact that they're Egyptians, they fear God. Now, I just want to flip this for 1 second. According to the commentaries who say that they were Jewish, so that would be a support that, well, I would expect that, Jewish women would fear God. Certainly, if I say that the women who we're speaking about are Yocheved and Miriam, of course they would fear God, so that makes a lot more sense. So now what I just want to point out is, without deciding which of these interpretations is correct, but I just want to see what are the ramifications of these two different ways of looking at the story. If I go by the Abarbanel's way and say that, in fact, the midwives were Egyptian, it makes it much easier in the understanding that Pharaoh would turn to his own, as he did in the very beginning of the story, and said, it's us against them. So you now help me out in in killing these Jewish babies. And not only that, but if you look later on, for those of you who have a Tanakh, if you look at chapter 5, the end of the Parsha, when Moshe comes, his initial appearance to Pharaoh, where he says, thus says the Lord, let my people go. So Pharaoh gives a counter, thus says Pharaoh, which then makes life much more intolerable for the Jewish people, which in a certain sense is really the low point of the enslavement of the Jewish people. And I just want to look at, at chapter 5, verse 6, where it says, and Pharaoh issued a decree that on that day to the Nogsim in the people and to their police officers. And I'll just tell you, and if only you can check me out, Rashi quotes a midrash that says, who are the Nogsim? They are Egyptians. Who are the Shotrim? They are Jews. Okay, actually, I apologize. I'm jumping the gun for one moment. So hold that for 1 second. I apologize for, so let me just backtrack for 1 second. If I say the midwives are Egyptians, then what we're doing is positing that we in fact have Egyptians who actually fear God. So maybe let me say this right now. This would be what we would call righteous Gentiles of the world. And I'll speak about this more in a few moments. If I say that, in fact, the women are Jewish, But then I have the problem. How would Pharaoh be collaborating or asking Jews to collaborate with him? So now let me go back to chapter 5, where what we find is that Pharaoh has actually set up a system of where there are nogsim, there are oppressors, and there are shotrim, there are policemen. The nogsim are Egyptian, the policemen are Jews. And so that what we find is that the ones who are directly coming in contact with the Jews are Jews. Which means that later on, we actually see that Pharaoh was getting Jews in his employ in order to be able to whip the Jews into working. And therefore, one could say, so Pharaoh is doing that right now. And I would even add, and what would be the logic? The logic behind it would be that should it be discovered that these women were actually killing the babies by the mothers, then the mothers would in fact be blaming Jews for what's happening and not Pharaoh. So that Pharaoh is able to keep himself clean from what's happening over here. Yes,
Mayor, we have.
so you wanted to ask a question or make a comment. Yes, Sandra.
Yes, I just had to unmute. Thank you. So to support the notion that the midwives were in fact Egyptian, it seemed at the beginning of this parsha, Pharaoh was speaking to the Egyptian people too. He's in the us versus them idea, which you just mentioned. Correct. This supports it because if in fact he's using the it's us versus them, when he speaks to the collective Egyptian people, then it would fall right into line with the Barbanel's idea that the midwives also were Egyptian, because yes, he's basically getting them all on his side and saying,
correct. I mentioned that before.
Yeah, so I'm saying, but that it's even supported more by the fact that the text itself says that he addresses the Egyptian people. So it would make sense that he's addressing the Egyptian people, co-opting the Egyptians to help him in his plan and going along that route. Even if, as you say, it's smarter in a tyrannical way to have the Jewish people doing it to themselves rather than to have the Egyptians doing it to them, which of course makes it is a countervailing argument. But a Barbanel, it makes sense. It makes more sense than not in the text because the king is co-opting his own people.
Yes, I just want to say personally, I can actually see a space for both of these opinions, and I'm not convinced one versus the other. I see what you just said right now, but on the other hand, I see that since Pharaoh is very, very devious, very demonical, that I could already see from the beginning how Pharaoh has as part of his plan to be able to pit Jew against Jew. And if he succeeds, then he's able to actually achieve his plan without having to dirty his own hands and without in any way getting blamed for it. So I can see that part of it as well.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, Bracha.
This precedent for a woman fearing God Moshe would not be there if not for Pharaoh's daughter.
Okay, so I would like to eventually come to that, but what I would say to you is correct. And in fact, I'll say this now, since the chances are I may not get to this at the end, so people always accuse me, but you missed, that in fact, it may very well be that the story of Pharaoh's own daughter creates a closure with the story of the midwives. And therefore, if I say that, in fact, the midwives were Egyptian, and that there are what we would call righteous Egyptian women, then Pharaoh's daughter becomes, in a certain sense, right, the proof of that, okay? And not only that, but the ultimate, culmination of that. So yes, in other words, that certainly would support that line of argument. And that's where I was going to be going to on a certain level. Okay, but since I see that I'm not moving fast enough, so let me just get on with more in terms of the midwives. So let me look at the fact that these women are named. Okay, and if you look at the commentary after the Abarbanel, Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, where he says Asher Shem Hachat Shifra, so he says his Kira Kadosh Baruch Hu at Shmam Lichvodam. God mentions their names to honor them out of respect for them. Shatizacharna Latov, that they should be remembered for good. Ki Samu Nafsham Bechapam, they place their life in their hand, Al Yisrael, to save the Jewish people, La'avor Mitzvat HaMelech, to transgress the command of the king. Okay, so what he's commenting on is, and it's that these women are actually named, okay, because generally when you name somebody, that reflects that they're people of distinction. And I'll just say this right now, the sforno that I have immediately after is actually from the beginning, the Parsha Shemot. And the sforno says, why is it called Shemot? Because we tell you the names of those who came down to Egypt. And in effect, the sforno says because the ones who came down to Egypt, the 12 tribes, the 70 souls, were people of stature. Each of them had a name which said that they are important. And then what the sforno says there is, and that's in contrast to what happens subsequently when that generation dies out, that they are nameless. There's just a mass. So that according to the sforno, if we name the midwives, that might be a reason to say that they actually have a name. They are important. They deserve their name. Here, I might say parenthetically, one of the things I thought about today, and that might be also why in the Pasuk, it doesn't refer to Pharaoh as Pharaoh, but rather as the king of Egypt. Because we have the parallel between the king of Egypt and the midwives, which simply describe your role. But the women are actually then introduced with a name where Pharaoh is nameless. And the reason why they're given that name is because of the next pasuk, because they feared God. And because they feared God, they deserve to have a name. So therefore, what I just want to point out with this is that evidently telling me who these women are is saying these women are significant. And what makes them significant is that they're prepared, as Rav Yosef Bechor Shor says, to put their lives on the line, to in effect transgress what Pharaoh commanded them, okay? And therefore, and why? Because they fear God. And therefore they deserve to have a name. Now, I'm going to get back to Yocheved and Miriam in 1 minute. Okay, Allison, don't worry. But now what I want to speak about for 1 minute is this idea of fearing God. And I realize I'm jumping a little bit, but you could check this later on. In Breshit, in chapter 20, in the story, okay, we'll also get to, I hope, why Pharaoh's daughter is not named, but if I don't, after the class, we can have questions and answers, and feel free. In chapter 20 in Breshit, there's a famous story of where Avram passes off Sarah as his sister. She's taken by Avimelech. God appears to Avimelech in a dream, and God says, don't touch this woman. She's actually his wife. Give her back. And then Avimelech, when he gives her back, or before he gives her back, calls in Abraham, and he says to him, how could you do such a thing? And Abraham there says, this is chapter 20 in Breshit, verses 11. He says, because I said, Rak ein yirat Elohim b'makom hazeh. Because there is only not a fear of God in this place, which is fascinating. And I want to quote something which the Netziv says there, which is very much relevant here. he says that in effect, Avimelech and his people were essentially decent people, but they didn't have fear of God. And why is fear of God important? Because if you have fear of God, then you will do the right thing no matter what. If you don't have fear of God, even if you're basically a good person, but there could be all types of situations, stressful situations, where you may end up doing the wrong thing and come up with a great rationalization to justify it. And therefore, what do I want to say over here? These midwives could have very easily justified collaborating with Pharaoh, because we understand that if they don't collaborate, if they disobey Pharaoh, there's a very good chance that they could be put to death. This is what's called in the halacha pikuach nefesh. And then they could have come up and justified saving themselves, okay, by killing these babies. Now, I just want to point out, halachically, that would not be acceptable. But halachically, it's not acceptable because God says so. And that's where fear of God comes in. And therefore, what I want you to see is the remarkable nature of these midwives is that they have principles. They're prepared to go all the way with their principles. Essentially, what they're saying is, what would God want me to do in this situation? Now, let me just bring up another point over here in terms of this idea of the rationalization. Note the fact that even though a number of commentaries use this language, but I think it's a very important point to note, it never says that Pharaoh commanded the midwives to do it. It simply says Pharaoh said to them. And it doesn't even say Pharaoh said to them. Pharaoh says, which means that hypothetically, okay, there is no command over here. If there's no command, then they don't necessarily have to do it. But on the other hand, perhaps that's also why the section begins, and the king of Egypt said to the midwives. And that's, remember I said to you, it says in the opening verse, the king of Egypt said to the midwives, right? And then it doesn't tell me what he said. And then he goes on to say, right, so maybe when the Torah doesn't tell me what he said, but now I want to conjecture. Maybe it wasn't anything in particular which the king actually said to them. Maybe it was the very fact that the king of Egypt summoned these women. The king of Egypt acknowledged these women. He acknowledged them by their names. He recognized that they are important. That maybe the whole atmosphere, the whole context in which the statement is being made is done in a way which is very clever, which is meant to empower these women in a way to go ahead and do what they're going to do. And here you are, right? You are now, right? My frontline troops, you are now, right, in my honor. And the reason why I'm pushing this point so much is because so the midwives could come along and say, yes, here we are. We are now, right, if you want to, we have the opportunity to ingratiate ourselves with Pharaoh, to now become people of real stature, especially if you assume that these are Egyptians, and yet they don't do it. They fear God. Now, let's look at what it is that they don't do. It says that they did not do what the king of Egypt commanded them, but then it says, "Vatchayena tayeladim." They gave life to the children. And in fact, Rashi quotes a midrash on the verse Vatchayenet hayeladim, misapkot lahem mayim umazon. They gave them water and drink, which means not only did they not kill these babies, but they actually nurtured these babies. And then when you look subsequently, when Pharaoh calls them and says, why did you not do what I asked you? Why is it that you actually gave them life? And the response in verse 19 is that the midwives say to Pharaoh, and here it says Pharaoh, not the king of Egypt, because they say the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, ki chayotena. And they say, B'terem tavo lehem hamiyaledet v'yaladu. Before the midwife comes, they've already given birth. And here there's a question, how do you understand this statement, ki chayotena? So one interpretation, excuse me, which Rashi actually quotes, is what the Targum says, chayot, as the Aramaic word chaya means a midwife, one who gives life. So what they say is they're their own midwives. And therefore they don't really need us. And therefore before we get there, they've already given birth. A second interpretation is that they're like animals, right? And animals don't have midwives, so they also don't need midwives. Ibn Ezra, if you look a little bit down on the next page, actually, the Ibn Ezra says, what does it mean, ki chayot hena? So the Ibn Ezra says, yesh lem koach chayim balev. They have a lot of life force in their heart, which means that they're vital, okay? They just have so much life attached to them. You could again say the life is exuding from them. So they pop out these babies. In any case, what I would like to point out is these midwives not only fear God, but these midwives are also very, very clever. And they're able to, in a certain sense, beat Pharaoh at his own game. And the idea being, if one of the things which I mentioned to you at the outset was that Pharaoh wants everything to be done in a very hidden way. He doesn't want the Jews to realize that these babies are being killed. He wants it to be done in such a way that it looks like just naturally they died. So that in the end, okay, people will not in any way suspect that there's a plan of extermination, of genocide. So the midwives essentially say to Pharaoh, well, what can we do? If they've already given birth, we can't then go and kill them because then it'll be very clear that we're killing these babies. And then the whole plan, right, is out in the open. So they're able to, in a certain sense, catch Pharaoh at his own game. And one could then add even more so, when they then go and nurture these babies, okay, well, that's part of the job. And so they have to keep, okay, the subtlety, the secretiveness of what's happening, so that in no way will they be suspect. And if you look down below, in the last reference on the page, Shemot Rabbah, okay, it's actually very, very interesting. That in Shemot Rabbah, look at where it says, why did the Torah have to say that they kept the babies alive? So it says there's praise within praise, okay? And now look at what it says in the third line, in the middle. Yesh mehem shayu aniyot, that there were situations of women who gave birth who were poor, v'holchot hamiyaldot, and the midwives would go, umagvot mayim umazom mibateim shel ashirot, and they would collect water and fruit from the house of the women who were rich, Ubaot v'notnot la'aniyot, and they would give it to the poor women. V'hein mechayot et bneihem, which means that if these women did not have food in their own house, they would go and make a collection by people who did have money in order to be able to feed these babies so that they would be kept alive. Yesh mehem, there were some babies who were born sheru'uyim latzeit chigrim, who should have come out lame, or sumim, or blind, or bali mumin, or with some other type of defect. Or lachtoch bo ever shiatza yafeh, okay? Or there might have been a need to maybe amputate them. Uma hayu osot, and what do the midwives do? Omdot b'tfilah, they would pray. Va'omrot lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and say to God, Ata yodea, you know, shelo kiyamnu dvarav shel Paro. We did not fulfill the words of Pharaoh. Dvarecha anu mevakshot lekayem. We want to do what you would like us to do. Ribon Holam Yetzei Havlad L'Shalom, Master of the Universe, let the baby come out complete. Shelo Yimtzeu Yisrael Yedeim La'asiach Leinu, so that no Jew will be able to have anything negative to say about us, that in any way we somehow damage their babies, which means according to this midrash, what does it mean they kept the babies alive? That they actually prayed to God, and this was part of their fear of God, asking God to not only let the babies be born, but to make sure that these babies are born in such a way that they are maximally well, so that no one would be able to say that in any way they did damage to these babies. So what I want you to see is the lengths to which these women disobeyed Pharaoh. But as I said, there was no actual decree here. It was Pharaoh simply suggesting, right, and blinking, so to speak, to make it clear what he really wanted to happen. By the way, I want to point out, this is why in the next verse, which I've quoted a few times, when the midwives did not do what he asked them, so he commands his people, because he sees that evidently it's not enough to just ask them, to tell them. He has to actually give a decree where then it becomes clear that if you're disobeying the king, okay, that will be a capital offense. Which again would go along if you assume that the people we're talking about are Egyptians, that he tried to get the backing of his people. It didn't work, so then he has to, in the end, command his own people. And that's where it broke down with the midwives. Now, the last thing which I want to just bring up is that what happens in the aftermath. It says in verse 20, Vayetev Elohim lamiyaldot, and God did well to the midwives. Vayirev ha'am vayatzmu ma'ot, and the people increase and they become very powerful. And then it says, Vayihi ki yaru hamiyaldot et Elohim, that because the midwives feared God, vayas lahem batim, he made for them houses. Now, I want you to realize that the overwhelming majority of commentaries conflate these two verses. And I would even say they don't really explain, when it says in verse 20, and God did well to the midwives, well, how does that fit with the second part? They simply say, well, God did well to the midwives, and what it says at the end of 21. But in fact, we have here actually two things. The first thing is God did well to the midwives in allowing what they themselves wanted to do, which is to enable the Jewish people to continue having babies, that it actually happened. And as a result of what they did, the Jewish people increased even more. And obviously, this is a boomerang to Pharaoh's whole plan. So that on the most fundamental level, the good which God does to the midwives is to bring the work of their hands to its fruition, to enable their efforts to succeed. The next verse says another thing. And because they feared God, God made for them homes. Now here, I gave you the Ibn Ezra at the end, who quotes one of the Gaonim, and he says over there in the on the top of page 2, Vayomer HaGaon ki asa lahem batim, that God made for them houses, shehistiram sham v'lo nimtza'u, that God essentially made what we would call getaway places for the midwives, that he made for them shelters so that they would somehow escape the reach of Pharaoh. So this is what the reward was, okay? That in the end, you disobeyed Pharaoh, but I'll make sure to protect you. I'm going to put you in a safe house. Personally, I have a little bit of a problem with that, although I could see where it's coming from. And the understanding of many commentaries, and this brings us back to Rashi's comment about Yocheved and Miriam, that when it says God made for them houses, it's not talking about a physical building, but it's talking about a line, a dynasty. And therefore Rashi says, well, if it's Yocheved, so from Yocheved came the whole line of Kohanim, Aaron and his sons. If it's Miriam, so from, and Rashi also says the Leviim, although Leviim came from other people as well. So what's unique to Yocheved is really the Kohanim. And from Miriam, he said what came from her is actually the Davidic line. Now, this is based on an analysis of Psukim, but the point, though, which I want to bring out is that, and this may also be part of the motivation to say it's Yocheved and Miriam, because if these women are significant, and if in fact certain lines, right, dynasties came down through these women, so we'd like to know who they are, and this is typically Midrash, that very often if there's somebody who's significant, but they're only mentioned once, you immediately try to identify them with someone else. And so here the tendency is to say Yocheved and Miriam, and because from them we actually find lines which came down. So if you think about it, though, the reward is in a certain sense commensurate with the act. That they not only saved Jewish babies, but presumably they actually saved Jewish babies who then had continuity. And therefore their blessing is that in their own lives, they actually they established dynasties with continuity. I'd like to add one more point to this, which is, if you look at the opening verse of chapter 2, and in fact, that's what you'll find on page, on page 2. I'm sorry, not on page 2. You'll find it on the top of page 3. The very next verse, or two verses after what I just had, it says, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. So it's very striking that the end of chapter 1 talks about God doing for the midwives batim, and then the beginning of chapter 2 talks about a man who goes from the house of Levi. And evidently, by using the language, the house of Levi, you're again not talking about a physical house, but you're talking about a legacy, something which is established, okay? Okay, so now if I just were to summarize what I had about the midwives, what we see over here is that there's, number one, a question. Are these midwives Jewish? Are they Egyptian? If they're Jewish, then this may be part of a very diabolical, devious plan of Pharaoh to pit Jews against Jews, and in the end to somehow be able to stay clear of the mess, so to speak. And it breaks down because these women fear God. In no way do they relate, identify with the king of Egypt. And these women, as we said, have names, they're significant personalities. If we take the Midrash, they're Yocheved and Miriam, they're Yocheved and Elisheva, Aaron's wife, okay? And ultimately, the reward for what they do is the success of their actions, and that in their personal lives, they found these dynasties. As we mentioned, these women are very clever, outmaneuver Pharaoh at his own game. The excuse which they give fits in to Pharaoh's plan of secrecy. And as a result, they say, well, what can we do? You want this to be done in a secretive manner. There's no way that we could do it. What we see is that these women actually go above and beyond their duty to just not kill the babies, but they actively maximize their potential to continue living. And what I would say is the way the women describe the Hebrew women, ki chayotena, perhaps is a description of them themselves. Namely, that these women are chayot. They have vitality. They have a passion for life. And they will do everything to promote life. Since I see my plan may not necessarily work, so it'll be more limited. So I want to actually look on page 2 at something which is not in the text, but which appears in the Midrash. And this is related to chapter 1, about the righteous women, and the merit of the righteous women, the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. So if you look at the middle of page 2, what I gave are the verses that describe the whole process of the enslavement of the Jewish people. And so what I'm going to do is look at Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, who describes that and says the following. When it says that the Egyptians embittered the lives of the Jews, excuse me, this is in verse 14. So it says the following, Kishira'u shehem parim v'ravim, that when they saw that the Jewish people were being fruitful and were multiplying, Hosifu limrar b'chayim ba'avodah, they embittered their lives with work. Shebetchila, what was the initial stage of the enslavement, which is what it says in verse 11. Vayiven arei miskinot, they built these warehouses, treasuries for Pharaoh. In effect, it was paying taxes through personal service. But then, Ulavasof, at the end, which is verse 14, Af bechol avodah basadeh, it wasn't being conscripted for national service. It was doing any type of menial job in the field. And then he says, Lita kramim v'ganim, to plant vineyards and gardens, ulechofram, right, and to dig whatever needed to be dug. Uleshadei tlamim achareihem, and then to make the furrows as part of the right digging process. Uvechol avodatam, and in every type of labor which they had them doing, hayu mishtabdim, shayu mishtabdim, which they subjugated them to, It would be done in a way which was backbreaking. They wouldn't leave them. Afilu lahargia, to be able to even chill out, as we would say. Ad bol amrekam rokam, until they even had to swallow their spit. They didn't even have the luxury of spitting out their spit, that they were so engrossed in getting the job done. Ela atzim, they were pressuring v'dochakim u'memaharim otam, and hurrying them, k'dei liyagam, in order to wear them down. The yishnu kol halayla, they would sleep the whole night, mitoch yigiatam, because they were so weary. V'lo yasku b'priya reviyah, and that way they wouldn't be able to engage in multiplying. So Rav Yosef Bechor Shor essentially says this whole process of enslavement eventually came to the point where the Jewish people were being so pressurized, and that there was absolutely, even if they had a moment to be able to engage in having sexual relations, okay, they were just too tired. They couldn't possibly do it. And they would, any free moment which they had, they would just want to go to sleep. And that was the reality of the enslavement. That was the plan of Pharaoh. Wear them down, okay? So that physically, emotionally, they would just not be able to engage in having babies. And by doing that, that's how he creates, right, this cap on Jewish population explosion. Now look at the quote below that from the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Sotah. It says, Darash Rabbi Avira. Rabbi Avira made the following drash. B'schar nashim tzidkaniot, in the merit of the righteous women, shahayu boto ador, that were in that generation, nigalu Yisrael mi Mitzrayim. The Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. B'sha'a sheholchot lish'ov mayim. When the women would go out to draw water from the Nile, Hakadosh Baruch Hu mezamein lahem dagim ktanim b'chadem. God would prepare for them small fish in their pitchers, v'shoavot, and they would draw mechza mayim mechza dagim, half fish, half water. Ubaot, and they would come. V'shoftot, and they would pour shteik derot, two pots, achat shel chamin v'achat shel dagim. In effect, they were actually cooking, right? They had two pots, one which had water, hot water, one which had fish. Umolichot eitzel ba'aleim l'sadeh, and they would then bring it to their husbands in the field. Marchitzototam, they would bathe them. Sachototam, they would anoint them. Ma'achilototam, they would feed them. Mashkototam, they would give them to drink. V'niskakot lahem bein shvatayim, and they would, niskakot is a nice word for they would join up with them, okay? Below the pots which they had that were cooking. The shemit abrot, and when they became pregnant, ba'ot lateim, they would come to their homes. The keven shemagia zman moldehem, and when the time came for them to give birth, holchot v'yodot basadeh, they would go and give birth in the field, tachat tapuach, under an apple tree. Now the Midrash, the Gemara gives you all kinds of verses, which is where they're coming from, and since we don't have the time to do this, we're not going to get into how they constructed this midrash, but I just want you to see the different parts. VeHaKadosh Baruch Hu sholech mishmei maram, and God would send from heaven mishem mankir mashpirotam, someone who would actually look out for these little babies. Excuse me. Kechayazo, like this, right? Midwife shemesh shaperet tavlad, who would take care to clean up the child. And God would gather these two, and this is the way it's understood based on the pasuk, stones, round stones, echad shel shemen ve'echad shel dvash, one that was filled with oil, one that was filled with honey, and they would be nurtured from these stones. And when the Egyptians kind of became aware of what was happening, they came to try to kill these babies. But a miracle happened. They were swallowed up in the ground. And then the Egyptians brought oxen, chorshim al gabav. They would plow the fields, right, on the backs of the babies. And after the Egyptians left, the babies would pop up out of the ground like grass. Okay, the point though, which I would like to focus on, and with this we will end, is that the Midrash looks at the psukim of the whole process of enslaving the Jews, and one could say, even looking at it through the lenses of Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, how the plan was to so debilitate, to so dehumanize the men, that in the end they would be totally incapable of having sexual relations and having babies. And then the Midrash, based on verses from Yechezkel, say that in fact the women had a counter plan. And as much as the Egyptians tried to debilitate the men, the women would come out to the men and they would bring back their humanity. They would wait for a moment when the men were resting. They would bathe them. They would anoint them. They would bring all the food that would nourish them. And when the men were now somehow brought back to being humans again, then they would have sexual relations. And then, as the Medrash goes on to say, that the women then became pregnant, they then gave birth, they then did everything to secure those babies. And in the end, right, God miraculously, reinforced whatever they did. Now, what I want you to see is that it's very interesting that what this Midrash is doing is essentially looking at what happened with the midwives and then extending that to the behavior of the Jewish women. And in the same way that the midwives, did not accept Pharaoh's suggestion, or you might say command, depending how you look at it, and did actively fought it. Not only did they not kill the babies, but they did everything to maximize their becoming vital and becoming healthy. So too the Midrash says this is what the women did in terms of not allowing the men to become dehumanized, to become resigned to the situation, but did everything to somehow keep up the spirits of the men, did everything through that to continue, right, the process of the Jewish people, Jewish continuity, to continue having babies and to do extraordinary things in order to keep those babies alive. And in the same way that we're told that God rewarded the midwives, how? By the fact that the Jewish people proliferated. So according to the Midrash, God reinforced the actions of Jewish women and in effect enabled all those babies to continue living. So let me just end, and I apologize that we didn't get further, by saying that what do we see about these women, these righteous women who brought about the redemption? I would say that the first thing that we see about them is that these are people who are not ready to simply submit to the reality and to say, what can we do, right? In other words, we're in a terrible reality and we just have to somehow allow the wave to just go over us. And we just have to submit to it and hope that in the end we can survive. But these are people who actively fought it. And in one case, or I could say in both cases, it was a function of a profound belief in God, a fear of God, a sense that in the end, this is what needs to be done. This is the right thing to do. And ultimately, we have to be prepared to, I would even say, endanger our lives in order to make it happen. They were people who did things in a very, very clever way. In one case, outwitting Pharaoh, and in the other case, finding how they could somehow maximize having their husbands have sexual relations and eventually having children. It wasn't just, okay, take them and let's mechanically do what we're doing, but creating a framework, right, of somehow bringing them back to their humanity. And the last thing which we find is that in both cases, their profound faith, okay, and their sense of what is right to do, in the end was rewarded by God. So if you will just allow me 1 minute, I'd like to say my mother was somebody who was a Holocaust survivor. Essentially, she had an extensive family who were killed during the Holocaust. She actually was married to my father in the middle of the Holocaust before the Nazis came into their town, but essentially they had to be separated relatively soon after they were married because my father was taken into the Russian army. My mother remained. My mother hid in the woods for an extended period, and it's mind-boggling how she was able to survive. But what I have to say about my mother, which is so remarkable, despite everything that she went through, my mother eventually came to the United States, was able to start a new life. She had me. She unfortunately was not able to have more children, but she did everything to make my life as pleasant as it could be, make my life as meaningful as it could be. And she saw with me, this is somehow how she could somehow continue, perpetuate, right? The house, the home that she came from, that was totally destroyed. And I will say that God certainly rewarded my mother's actions, because my mother was able to, at a certain point in her life, make Aliyah. After I made Aliyah, she was able to witness not only grandchildren, but even great-grandchildren. She was able to live in Israel for a period of over 30 years as someone who saw the total destruction of the Jewish people. She was able to experience the total rebirth of the Jewish people. So that for me, that's why this story is so meaningful. And why it's very, and my mother, I would also throw in, was a very, very religious person. People would be amazed at how she davened in the fervor, but not in a very visible way, but in her own modest way. This profound, deep sense of a relationship to God, which I feel she gave to me. So I would like to say that what was true in the time of Egypt, I think also has been true in our own day, has been true throughout the generations. And that I think this is also what has kept the Jewish people going. A people that's very much committed to life, a people that has a sense of a vision of the future. And as you see in the Parashat, and I think we've seen it in many other situations, there is no question that the women played a very central role in that process. And in the end, Bezrat Hashem, this should bring about the ultimate Geulah. Thank you, everyone.
Yasher Koach.
Okay, and I'll just say, since I promised to say it before, whoever needs to leave, so feel free to leave. The later on when we talk about Pharaoh's daughter, and we don't mention her by name. Okay, I think that it's very striking on a number of levels, but I'll just say it's also very interesting that in chapter 2, we also don't mention Moshe's mother by name. We also don't mention Moshe's father by name. We also don't mention Moshe's sister by name. And in fact, the only person who has a name in chapter 2 is Moshe. So that it may very well be that the lack of the names of each of these people is there because we want to highlight even more so the name of Moshe. And maybe even the greatest, how should I put it, memorial to the daughter of Pharaoh is that she is the one who gave Moshe his name. And that with the name that she gave him, in a certain way, was prophesying, okay, his future role as the Redeemer of Israel. For those of you who've heard my previous podcast, we also spoke about in chapter 24 in Bereshit, the whole story of Abraham's servant finding a wife for Yitzchak. Everybody, of course, says, well, Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, but as we noted in other sessions, he's never mentioned by his name there. He's either mentioned as the servant of Abraham or as the man. And the only one who's actually mentioned there by name is Yitzchak. And maybe that's, in a certain sense, the greatest accolade to this person, that in the end, he is able to bring about the continuity of Yitzchak. He is ultimately the servant of God, and the fact that or the servant of Abraham, the fact that he's the servant of Abraham, the name that he promotes is Abraham's name, eventually Isaac's name. That is the greatest name that you could say. So I would say that with Pharaoh's daughter, perhaps what it's saying is, here is Pharaoh's daughter, and the irony that she, of all people, who we would have assumed should have collaborated with Pharaoh, and here, Bracha, what you brought up, she is the ultimate closure of the story of the midwives. She would be the first one that you would assume, and a number of commentaries say it. She should have clearly followed her father's directives, and that she should be the one who opposes the father, and not only opposes the father, but actively saves Moshe. Not only did she not kill this baby knowing he was a Hebrew, but she then sees to it that he has a nurse from among the Hebrews. And ironically, or maybe not so ironically, that nurse is his mother. And as I said, and she is the one who names him, who through that name gives him his destiny, and that is the name that we know him by. So yes, she's not named, but maybe all the other things really tell us who her name is. Okay, I hope that at least is an attempt to respond to that question. Okay, if there's any other question, feel free. If not, we'll call it a night. Okay, everyone, thank you for bearing with me. I apologize again, but I thought that it would be important. One of the things is that I would like to maybe look at the text much more closely rather than just lecture, and to give you more of a sense of what we would actually do in Pardes. Okay, yes, I see there are two hands. Yes, Allison.
Okay, first of all, thank you for that beautiful tribute to your mother. That was really very meaningful. Just sort of a tangential question. You mentioned that Miriam, that her descendants, that from it comes the Davidic line. I'm unaware that she ever married or had children. So how does that work?
You could look at Rashi's commentary, and then maybe it's because the Midrash connects Miriam with someone mentioned in Chronicles called Ephrat, and Ephrat marries Kalev, and or actually a part of that from the tribe of Yehuda. And from there is a whole, I wouldn't say so convoluted, but a, a way of saying so that Miriam, according to that, founded the Davidic line.
So she did marry?
She did marry, and she in fact married somebody very, very significant.
Huh.
But this is all based on the assumption that of connecting different names and saying this person is named Ephrat is actually Miriam, and then following, where she went, and it even takes more than to follow where she went. You have to.
And the other thing is that I had always learned that Shifra and Puah were Hebrew names, not Egyptian names. So how does that work?
Well, look, let's put it this way. Obviously, if you assume that they were Egyptians, so then they are Egyptian names. And then that's the question, what do they mean exactly? If you take Rashi, and the Midrash, so the Midrash actually explains it. So the Midrash says, yes, Shifra and Puah are Hebrew names, because Shifra is related to the word Shipur, Lishaper, which means to improve, with the idea being that her role, and essentially the two names are descriptive in terms of the roles that they played. Shifra,
so how do you ignore
the roles of midwives?
So how do you ignore the Midrash?
No, they don't ignore those. On the contrary.
No. How did the other commentators ignore that it's saying that these are Miriam and Yocheved?
Oh, how do they say it? Very simply, because it says Shifra and Puah. In other words, you're now connecting with Miriam and Yocheved, who says that they're the same people. In other words, Shifra, what I could say is I could say Shifra and Puah are Jewish. I could say what the meaning of their names are. And I could say that these were Jewish women who were very, very significant. But the problem which you have, which is presumably why the Midrash does what it does, is because if they were so significant, then we should have heard something else about them. And if you understand that when it says God made for them batim, that would have to do with some type of line, family line. So where do we find any kind of family line that emerges from Shifra and Puah? So this is where the Midrash comes in, but this is very typical Midrashic, that whenever you come across some figure that seems to be very, very important, but we don't hear about them anywhere else, then the tendency is to immediately identify them with someone else that we know. And here, contextually, it also fits in very nicely on a number of levels. By the way, just as an example of this, if you look in chapter 14 in Breshit, there's this king Malki Tzedek. So the Midrash says, who is Malki Tzedek? That's Shem, the son of Noah. Why? Because he's a very righteous individual. Well, who else could possibly have been a righteous individual living in that context? Or Amraphel in that same context, who is the king of Shinar. They identify with Nimrod. So I'm just saying, you find that this is something which appears in a number of places in the Midrash. Okay, that's what we have here. Now, to be honest with you, if I say that Shifra and Puah are Egyptians and they're Egyptian names, so I don't know exactly what they mean. I will tell you, though, that there are definitely commentaries who say that when the daughter of Pharaoh calls Moshe, Moshe is actually an Egyptian word, okay, which simply means child. So that it doesn't have any, but in the Torah, it actually treats it as a Hebrew word, giving you the reasoning behind that Hebrew word. So and in true Jewish fashion, could be both of them are true. That maybe there is such a word as Moshe in Egypt, or maybe there is such a word in Egyptian which has one meaning, but it's like a double entendre. In other words, it takes on a whole other meaning, right? And it's a play on words in Hebrew.
Okay.
Yes. Bracha, do you want to say?
So that there's such fierce competition that there's two very strong camps, one saying that they were Jewish and one saying that they were Egyptian, leads me to wonder whether they were even more audacious than we had thought, and whether there was a collaboration between an Egyptian woman and a Jewish woman, and that they were both.
That would be a very interesting idea. I haven't seen anybody who says it. Okay, so I don't know. You could be the first, but it could be. In other words, and it could be that maybe in the context of the midwives, that somehow those, if you want to use class stereotypes, are broken down, and maybe there was some sort of collaboration between Jews and Egyptians. Could be. Okay. Yes, Yael.
I've always, the biggest question that always comes up for me is, why did Pharaoh allow a Hebrew baby to live in the palace and grow up there? He was out exterminating Hebrew babies because of various reasons. And why did he allow it? Because he knew Moshe was a Hebrew baby.
Okay, why did he do it? Your question is an excellent question. And whatever I'll say to you is speculative. The answer which I have is because his daughter was pushing it very strongly, that at a certain point, right, she was not prepared to hide the fact that this baby exists, and she wanted to raise the baby as her own, and she brought him into the palace. There, in fact, is a midrash which says that when she brought the baby in, she, even before that, insisted that Pharaoh stop his decree of throwing babies. And if you assume that, and I say if because we don't have any textual basis to necessarily say that, but then what it shows you, but I think you already see that even with the story of the midwives, is that the moment there was any type of opposition to Pharaoh's plan, Pharaoh kind of backed down. And if his daughter was very, very emphatic that she was not going to allow this baby to die, that on a certain level, she was able to get her father to back down. And the reason why I push this point is because Nachmanides has a whole thing, and it's certainly very worthwhile to read it, how Pharaoh needed the cooperation of the Egyptians, because Nachmanides, this is 700 years ago, says, without their cooperation, he never could have done it. And so if you now take what I just said, it then raises the question, well, what if there had been more Egyptians who would have opposed Pharaoh? Then maybe none of this would have ever happened, which therefore means that the Egyptians were collaborators, and I would say active collaborators in what happened. By the way, if you read Nachmanides' commentary, it's actually chilling in terms of seeing the parallels to the Holocaust. And so the same thing would be true. What if there were more Germans or Ukrainians or Poles who would have opposed what was happening over there? Then that could have gone along, and you could even say Americans, that could have certainly gone a long way in stopping it, but they didn't. So therefore, that makes it even more the case that what the midwives, if you assume they're Egyptians, but certainly Pharaoh's daughter, that if you look at what they did, it really becomes a condemnation of the rest of Egyptian society. That in other words, here were people who were prepared to stand up, who in the end, on a certain level, brought Pharaoh to back off, okay? And what if more people had done it? It would have been a completely different story. So that's my take on it. Okay, everybody, we have to end now. Shabbat shalom, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you, Rav Meir. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Beautiful.
Bye.